With Deshaun Watson looking like he could potentially go to the Saints or the Falcons, which team do you think is going to land Watson when it's all said and done?
Shit, man, I thought it was gonna be Seattle last week, and now we're talking about two totally different teams that we didn't even see coming. I mean, the Saints were kind of like on the outside looking in when we had made our episode last week, and now we're talking about the Saints being one of the favorites. The Falcons to me make no sense. The Falcons have no offensive weapon outside of Kyle Pitts. Calvin Ridley suspended. Um, I don't even know any other receivers outside of Cordell Patterson, who is playing running back as well. So I mean, like, granted, there is somewhat of a Debo Samuel type of weapon there, but Atlanta doesn't really have a defense either. Atlanta's competing in a very competitive division, especially with Tom Brady coming back for his 23rd year. To me, it doesn't make sense for him to go to Atlanta. It makes more sense to at least go to New Orleans because you have Michael Thomas. The Alvin Kamara situation isn't necessarily settled, but if Mark Ingram is there, you have a notable, successful running back. You have a good offensive line. You have a solid defense, a good coaching staff. You have good veteran players around you. And it just, again, New Orleans has an immediate hole for the quarterback position because they have not re signed Jameis Winston. Taysom Hill didn't work out. Atlanta, that whole debacle is just to me weird because we all know that the cap hit for Matt Ryan is $48 million. Who in their right mind is going to absorb that hit? Like, who is going to take that? And his preferred destinations, I believe, if they do agree to acquire Deshaun Watson, he had mentioned Cleveland and Seattle. So are those teams ready to go out and absorb basically $50 million for a quarterback in his late 30s who has steadily declined in terms of percentages and total output over the last 4 seasons? I don't know. Again, it just Seattle, I mean, excuse me, New Orleans just seems like the right fit because they have a little bit more of a ready to win team as opposed to Atlanta low key is in rebuild mode. They have a lot of random pieces. They have a lot of not necessarily big names, but you know what I mean? It's really hard to kind of pinpoint what I'm trying to say here. Atlanta kind of sucks. So I don't know why Deshaun team would go from one bad team to the other, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, the way that I see it is that when it comes to where Deshaun Watson is going to go, I think this is fairly cut and concise for me. I see him going to the Saints, and it seems fairly obvious to me. And here's why. When I look at what Houston is going to trade for, why would Houston go out of their way to trade Deshaun Watson, who is going to get paid $35 million this upcoming season? And they're going to take a bigger cap hit with potentially Matt Ryan if they were to trade him to the Falcons. That doesn't really make any sense to me.
There would
If
be a
you're,
third team suitor if that happens.
I'm just saying, like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because let's just say for hypothetical purposes that it's only a two-team trade and that Houston ends up making the deal with Atlanta and Atlanta ships Matt Ryan to Houston. I just don't see why Houston would take on, a $48 million quarterback next year in Matt Ryan, who, by all intents and purposes, is, I'm not saying falling off at this point, but is slowly, you know, degrading as far as what we saw from him a couple years ago when he won an MVP and took the Falcons to the Super Bowl in Super Bowl 51. But when I look at with the current situation with the Saints to me seem like a more enticing trade partner for Houston, just because New Orleans has kind of made it a more open situation because look at all the cap space that they freed up by restructuring some of the contracts that they have on their roster. They restructure contracts with guys like Taysom Hill, Bradley Roby, Malcolm Jenkins, and Demario Davis, and it's opened up a lot of cap space to the point where they have about $30 million in cap space. Granted, they would have to make a couple more adjustments with their salary cap to absorb what Watson's potential salary is next year in $35 million. But to only be $5 million off with what Watson would bring into the fold as far as his cap hit goes, it's a lot better than what they were originally just a couple weeks ago when Kevin, we were both talking about the cap situation that the Saints were faced with, and they were one of the worst teams as far as their cap position goes after the season had ended. So they definitely made some adjustments as far as what it's going to be like for next season for their cap. But I mean, overall, I think Deshaun Watson would do much better in New Orleans just because when you look at New Orleans the last couple of years, even though that Tampa Bay Buccaneers seem to be the better team overall, the Saints have given them trouble since Tom Brady's gotten there. The Saints are 4-0 against the Tom Brady led Buccaneers since Brady got there. And then when you bring somebody like Deshaun Watson into the fold, I think the Saints could be able to continue that type of play against their division rivals in the Buccaneers going into next season. I think overall, I think if you're looking at it from Houston's perspective, I think Houston, I think New Orleans is probably the move just because I think Deshaun would actually get a decent, he would get a fresh start in New Orleans, and it would actually be, I think, a more competitive team to play with than what the Falcons currently have on their roster. And I think as far as the rebuild is concerned, I think it just makes more sense for Houston at this point, just because if you were going to trade him to Atlanta, Kevin, like you mentioned, if you were going to add a third team into the mix, I don't know why you would necessarily do that when you can make the move with one team in New Orleans and not have a third team act as like having a third party in there would kind of seem, I wouldn't say pointless, but it would just be more work than what it's intended for. And I just think overall, I think if it's coming down to these two teams between the Saints and the Falcons, I think the Saints are the more enticing trade partner at this point instead of the Falcons, where you could potentially add a third team into the trade. That's just how I see it.